Well, today we are concluding the series we've been in for the last couple weeks called You Asked For It. We've been dealing with incredibly important, difficult topics together. I want to bring us back where we've been so we can end the series strongly here today. We've dealt with 3 questions so far. The first question that we dealt with was, how can I understand God's will when making big decision? We heard so many people come up and say, I'm actually in the middle of a big decision, or I invited someone who's making a big decision. Thank you for talking about that. During the talk, we talked about the idea of praying the prayer of indifference, how we say if we're going to hear from God, we have to allow ourselves to be indifferent to what the options are in front of us, to say, God, I know I sort of have some desires, some wants, some ways I want this to go, but help me to be indifferent, to lay all my desires aside and just hear what you want, to be indifferent to anything but your will alone. Pray prayer of wisdom and to spend time in silence and listen and allow God to speak into our life. And then at some point, we just have to make a decision if we don't know exactly what to do. And we have to act in faith, and we have to do what we believe would most honor God with our life if we would step out and make this decision in this direction. The second question we dealt with was, how could a good God allow so much suffering? What an incredibly important question that humans for thousands of years have asked over and over and over again. How could a good God, if he is good, allow so much suffering in the world around us? And we drew it out from a 20,000-foot view and said, yeah, there is suffering in the world, and it's all around us. You can look in the news, watch what's happening in the world around us. There is suffering, and it's happening right here, right now, in our state and around the world. But in the middle of that, we said, the reality is there's this big story that God's telling, this big story that God's writing. In the very beginning of the story, there was no suffering, that's not what God created us for. And at the end of the story, there will be no more suffering anymore either. No more tears, no more heartache, no more broken hearts, no more broken bodies. But we're in the middle of a story, so we must not lose heart. Because though we don't experience a life apart from suffering right now, one day, the promise to all those who are in Christ Jesus, who have a relationship with God, at the end of the story, it ends really well. And he is a good God, and he won't allow suffering forever. The third question we dealt with last week was, what is my responsibility when it comes to social and political issues? And we talked about how Jesus cast his vision for the church to be salt and light, to not just be in the world, not just walking around, not just doing our own thing or trying to be like the world, but to be salt and light, meaning we would shine light into the darkness. And we would help our cities and our communities and our world and our nation get closer to the picture that God has for each one of us. And yet we said at the end of it, the reality is that though there's many things we can do in this world, there's only one thing that can truly change a human heart. That we can't change a nation or a people from the outside in, but it's from the inside out as people encounter a personal relationship with Jesus, and then as Jesus changes them over years, that their life really changes, then their communities really change, then the world can actually change in the way that God endeavored it to do. And so we said the gospel is greater than politics, that our heart and our intentions and our energy should be going most closely to the gospel as our solution at the end of the day. The question that we're dealing with here as we close this series today, many other questions we could have answered, maybe we'll do those in years to come together as a church. But the question we're going to deal with today is a question that a lot of people responded strongly in a desire to see us deal with, which tells me that this is the question that we're wrestling with, or that we know people are wrestling with it. And so to spend time dealing with it, and it's another human question that so many people wrestle with, is deeply important for us to do this morning. And the question is this: can I have faith and still doubt? What a simple yet difficult, challenging question. And that's my task this morning. I want to start by telling my own story. In the summer of 2007, in June specifically, Christina and I were going to go on a trip to go see her family in Connecticut, and specifically in the Boston area. How many of you have ever been to the Boston area? It's great. We were going there, and we were going to spend time there, see all these sides. I'd never been to Boston before. So anyway, we went up there, and one day we were moving gravel in the front yard of her grandfather's house with her father, and we were moving gravel. How many of you ever go on vacation in order to move gravel? Yeah, me neither. So I didn't bring any shoes to do that, to move gravel. And so I borrowed some shoes from the family, and they were a little bit small for me, but I was just going to soldier through and do my part. In the middle of it, I thought, my feet are feeling so strange doing this today. I was like, they're just too tight. We got to get this done and move on. Well, the crazy thing in my story is the next morning I woke up and my toes were numb. How many of you lay on an arm at night and you wake up and it's like you can't really move it right and it's numb? But the ends of my toes were numb, and I thought, surely I didn't sleep in such a way that made all 10 of my toes numb. During that day, we went into Boston, and we were driving in there, and we were walking around. I said, honey, I don't know what's happening, but that numbness that was in my toes is now fully in my ankles, and it's growing up my calves. So we got a little bit spooked, thinking, what exactly is happening? By the time we got on a plane and drove back, I was numb from the tips of my toes to my belly button. And when I say numb, I mean especially my knees and my feet were like Novocaine numb, if you've ever had something dental work done, where they can cut you and you don't feel it. I didn't try to do that, but I actually believe I could have cut myself and not felt it. I was that numb at that moment. I went to the doctor as soon as I get back, right? You rush in, try to figure out what's going on. Been so healthy my entirety of my life, and I went in and the doctor looked at me and he's like, okay, so you were sick at the beginning of your trip, which was true. I had been sick right when we got there. He said, okay, so you were sick at the beginning. I think it's something viral is going on in your body. I said, okay, well, that's great. So you're thinking it'll just go away on its own? Yeah, it's just gonna go away on its own. He said, I could send you to somebody else, but I think that's all very premature. So I went home and I just didn't feel right about it. Like, we know our own bodies, and maybe that would be possible. And so I called back and I said, who were you going to send me to if you hadn't sent me just home? And he said, I would have sent you to a neurologist. And I said, well, I'd like you to schedule that appointment because I know it's going to take a while to get in. He said, I really don't think you need to do it. I said, here's the deal. At the end of the day, if I feel better, I'm not going to go. He's like, okay, fair enough. I'll schedule the appointment. Well, I got to the appointment 6-7 weeks later. Some of it gotten better, some of it gotten worse in that period of time. And I got there and the doctor said, look, we're going to test you for a bunch of stuff. Here are the things I don't think you have. These are all the scary things when I'm going to list them, but I don't want you to worry about it. I don't think you have these things, and we're going to test these other things. My guess is it's going to be one of the other things. I said, okay. I wish it'd be nothing. I wish it'd be what the first doctor says, but I'll take one of these things instead of one of these things. After taking a lot of blood, how many of you ever had like a lot of blood taken at one time? Yeah. A number of tests, even pricking me with needles, all kinds of stuff they did to me. I'm feeling like a human experiment. 3 weeks later, I believe, I went in for the doctor's appointment, and he said, I know I said you didn't have one of these, and you don't have hardly any of them, but you do have this one. You have multiple sclerosis. And I said, I've heard of it. I don't even know what it is. Shock. Ever been shocked? Just total shock that that could even be true of me, that was the case. I think at that point I was 27 years old to be diagnosed with something like that. He said, here's the deal. I don't want you to go home and read about it. I said, how am I going to do that? So what did I do? I went home and I read about it, right, immediately. But before we did, Christy and I got in the car, and we just couldn't believe what we just heard. And we went across the street to 81st and Harvard, if you remember, to a rib crib. I think it's right there, 81st and Yale. A rib crib that's right there on the corner because we hadn't eaten anything and we planned to eat before we went home. And we sat in that rib crib and we just cried like we had never cried before together. And in that moment we thought, our dreams are crushed. We always dreamt we'd have kids. Now we have 3 kids, but we didn't have any kids then. Our dreams are crushed. Our hopes are shattered. We had this dream that we would get to 75 years of marriage because we got married at 6, so that was possible. Now, we got married at 21, so it is possible. But we thought, I don't know how long I have to live. I don't know what the case is. The doctor really didn't tell us anything that day. Not the best way to tell somebody, the way he told us. We went home with very little information, but this huge diagnosis we thought was a death sentence. And here's the reason I tell this story this morning. For the next week, every night when I laid in bed, I just looked at the ceiling. If you ever had something really bad happen in your life, and I just stared at the ceiling in great despair and so much doubt and misunderstanding and complexity. And Christina would go to sleep. She's trying to be there for me, but she'd eventually fall asleep, but I couldn't sleep. I'm just staring and thinking, how did we get here? How could this possibly be true of us? And I can't explain it other than just the grace of God. But at the end of about 7 days, that's the way that I remember it, at the end of 7 days, laying there in the bed, I just had this sense in my heart and this conversation that was happening internally. And I said, God, I've preached the message of the gospel. I've believed in eternity, what God can do in the human heart. We just planted a church a year before because we had this dream to change a community, a nation, a generation with the gospel. God, I've believed all that. I've preached all that, but do I really believe it's true? And I'd never had that thought ever in my life. And I laid there after some time, and here's where I ended and landed the plane by God's grace in my heart. I said, God, if I can trust you with forever, how dare I not be able to trust you with today? And I changed. And not that I never had another struggle with it, because I have, when things don't seem like they're working right, or I'm worried about going to the doctor again to get an update or whatever, and God has not healed me of multiple sclerosis to the best of my understanding at this point, though I'm incredibly healthy for 11 years of diagnosis, incredibly healthy for 11 years. I still had those rumblings, and I always have gone back to, but God, if I can trust you with forever, then I have to be able to trust you with today as well. It only makes sense. And God brought me out of it, which is so much hope. There's a story in the Bible in Mark chapter 9. A father has a child who's very sick. In fact, he's possessed by demons and has been possessed from a very young age, which has caused all this great physical problems in his life and trembling and all these things that are happening for him. And the man has brought his son to the disciples of Jesus so that they can pray for him and heal him, but they've been unsuccessful in healing him. And so he brings his son to Jesus in Mark chapter 9 and comes to him and says, Jesus, your disciples prayed, but nothing happened. And Jesus is somewhat frustrated at the moment. He said, well, how long has your son been sick? And he said, he's been sick his whole life. He's been so sick all along the way. And the man says to Jesus, but if you are able, if you can do something, would you please take pity on me, and would you help us with our son? Mark chapter 9, verse 23, Jesus says back to him, if you can, everything is possible for the one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my belief. See, this is the human process. I don't know where everybody is here this morning in your faith. Maybe you're beginning to ask questions. You're just beginning a faith journey of beginning to believe in Jesus, or believe that maybe there is a God out there who maybe does actually care about you, or whether you've been walking with God for a long period of time. This message is for all of us, because at the end of the day, our prayer is the prayer of the Father. Father, I do believe, but I need you to help me with my unbelief. You see, that's what I was doing all that week and have done many times in my life since then. Jesus, I do believe. But when I struggle to believe, I need you to fill in the blanks. I need you to help me with my unbelief, because I can't help myself. I need you to help me believe when I can't believe any longer. The misconception in church, the misconception as we understand faith is this. The misconception is that some think that faith means an absence of doubt. But that is not true. Faith is not the absence of doubt. In fact, doubt is often involved in the origination and the creation of faith in the human heart. Let me give you an example and a different way to say it. If we drew out a spectrum and you put one word on one end and another word on the other that are opposite words, we might take good on one side and we would put evil on the other. Wouldn't we all agree? Good and evil feel like the exact opposite ends of a spectrum, correct? In the middle might be a lot of the actions we take in life. Sometimes they're a little bit better, but we have our own motivation in our heart. Or sometimes we do something bad and hurt somebody, but really we weren't trying to do that. And so often we're on a spectrum between good and evil, not on the extremes. Okay, you got the idea. Now, if we take faith, let's take good and evil out of the equation. Let's put faith on the end of a spectrum. What do most people believe is on the other end of the spectrum? Most people, and that may be many of us in this room, believe the same thing, and that is the doubt as the other end of the spectrum. You either have faith and belief or you have doubt. But that's not biblically the case. The other end of the spectrum is not doubt. The other end of the spectrum is a word we call unbelief. And unbelief, unlike doubt, doubt is when we have serious questions or we have concerns or things that are unresolved in our heart and they're sincere and we want to believe, but we're struggling to believe. That's what doubt is. Unbelief is a choice to resist believing altogether. Unbelief is the choice to not believe at all and not want to believe. It's where we end up, if you've ever been at this point in your life or known somebody or read somebody that talks this way, cynics about faith are ones who actually are trying to find reasons not to believe. They're not trying to believe themselves. They're trying to say, this is why I don't believe, and create all these reasons for it. It's the choice to unbelieve, to stand against belief, and that is different than doubt. Because doubt is sincere and it's heartfelt, and it's not that we don't want to believe. It's like the father in the story who says, if you could do anything to help us, Jesus, it would make a difference for the rest of our life. And Jesus says, if I can do anything, if I can, he said, it's possible if you will only believe. And the man says, well, then I want to believe, and help me with my doubts and believing. That is not unbelief. Unbelief is when those who stood against Jesus, when he'd heal at the Sabbath or do good for other people, they say they try to pick holes and find problems with what he was doing because they didn't want to believe at all. Faith on one hand, unbelief on the other, and doubt is living rampant around all of them at the same time. This is the truth of the scriptures, and I'll prove it to you this morning. There's a quote from Lee Strobel in The Case for Faith, which I think is such a great book. If you're looking to read anything, if you're struggling with faith, if you have questions that we maybe didn't get to during this series, what a great book to spend time with and wrestle with and see that many of our questions that we think are unanswerable are answerable with faith, and the ones that aren't answerable, then ultimately we just have to trust God with the rest of them at the end of the day. But Lee Strobel, in this book, The Case for Faith, says, as long as you have faith, you will have doubts. Faith is required only when we have doubts, when we do not know for sure. When knowledge comes, faith is no more. It's no longer needed. When I know something is true completely, then I don't need faith anymore. In fact, somebody came up to me after service and says, it says that what we need as believers is faith, hope, and love. But they said the amazing thing is when we get to heaven, that two of those aren't needed any longer. What two are those? Faith and hope. Love endures. The greatest of these is love. Why? Because it endures and it continues. But I don't need faith when I get to eternity, because I will see it and it will be clear and you won't be able to talk me out of it. And I will have no doubts any longer. And I don't need hope anymore because I've encountered hope and hope has been completed in me. But in this life, we need faith and hope because we don't see everything. And so even in the midst, as he says, as long as you have faith, you will have doubts. Faith is required only when we have doubts, when we do not know for sure. An example that I might give is if I held up a hand, and you already know there's nothing in my hands, but if I held up my hand, I said, hey, I have something in my hand, do you believe it? You'd say, I don't know, 50-50. Maybe you have something, maybe you don't. I say, well, I just want to be more specific. I have a quarter in my hand. Do you believe I have a quarter in my hand? You say, well, Brad, you're a good guy. I generally trust you. I'm going to say you have a quarter in your hand, but I have some doubts inside of me. Wouldn't that be the case? But if I open my hand and that quarter was sitting there and I said, do you believe I have a quarter in my hand? What would you just say? Yes, I believe you have the quarter in your hand. But you don't need much faith to say that any longer, do you? What Lee Strobel is saying in The Case for Faith is when we have faith, there's always going to be an element of uncertainty and an element of questions and an element of doubt. And maybe you've never heard that in church today because people are worried that we might lose our faith when we start to talk about our doubts. But the opposite is the truth. When we don't talk about our doubts, that's when faith is going to struggle to survive the most. When we wrestle with our doubts, when we wrestle with other people, and we believe anyway, that's when our faith can go to the next level. What is faith then? If it's not unbelief, if unbelief is at the end, what is the definition of faith? I'm going to give this morning. Faith is the courage to trust God in the midst of uncertainty. You hear that? It's not the removal of uncertainty. It's not the removal of even doubts. We'll use doubts as a very big, broad definition here today, where there's questions or things we don't know. Things aren't certain in this life. Faith is the courage to believe even in the midst of our uncertainty and in the midst of our doubts. That's what the great men and women of Scripture are commended for. Not because they had all the knowledge or was all the evidence was before them, but because they believed God despite the lack of evidence to prove what they believed was true. What could uncertainty look like? It could be questions like, how could a good God allow so much suffering? That's a question that we've talked about in this series that we struggle with. That can be a tough question we deal with in the midst of uncertainty. Can I still believe? Faith is the courage to believe even when that question isn't answered fully in this life. Faith is the courage to trust God in the midst of our personal issues, our details, that loss of a job, that loss of a child, that health problem, that person you prayed for at their bedside that was in the hospital that didn't survive even though you prayed so hard for them. It's to trust God, to have the courage to be able to trust even when everything around you is struggling so much. This is what we find in the Bible. Hebrews chapter 11, this great chapter of the Bible. You want to read a Bible that gets you excited? In the middle of it, it's this chapter about faith, the great men and women of faith, the Noahs, the Josephs, the Moseses, all these people that lived by faith in the midst of so much uncertainty, in the midst of so much lack of evidence around them, but still had the courage to trust God in the middle of it. That's what faith is. But they had their doubts too. Abraham, who's in the middle of the story, who's called the father of our faith. He's the very beginning, maybe one of the men who has the greatest faith in all of the Bible. In fact, his faith, 3 major religions, so they all believe the same thing, they all go the same direction, all bring their faith back to Abraham. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. We all go back because Abraham had incredible faith to trust God. And how did he do it? He lived in a city, and God said, I want you to leave the city you're in, all the people you know, all your wealth ultimately even behind, all your family's family that lives in that area, and I want you to leave that country and go to a different country. And the Bible says he went not even knowing fully where he was going, which is different today. You can take out a map, you can Google it, you can figure out it's going to take 9 hours and 23 minutes if you drive speed limit to get there today. He just left and went to a place he'd never been before without clear directions, trusting God, that God said go, so I'm going to go. Courage to trust God in the midst of uncertainty. And yet it gets bigger than that. God promised him that he was going to have children. He's going to be a father of a great nation. And he began to believe God, but then he just kept getting older and older and older. And they thought, well, maybe we missed something God wanted to tell us. So Abraham and Sarah make a decision. We need to help God in the process of answering his own promises to us. And they find her maidservant, Hagar, and bring them into the family. Abraham sleeps with her. She has a child, and they try to fast forward God's timeline and ultimately mess up their own family. Why do I say all that? Abraham's the father of our faith. I don't think any of us could probably want to be put up on that level of faith next to Abraham. And yet, what did Abraham struggle with? He struggled with doubt. And he didn't let doubt win the day. He didn't give himself fully to doubt. He didn't just commiserate in doubt and sit in doubt and refuse to believe, but he tried to keep pushing forward in the midst of his doubts to trust God and have the courage to do it. This is the father of our faith who had doubt as well in his life. And so we say, biblically, faith and doubt often coexist in the same heart. They're not two different people. Like, we're going to give an example, like you're the person of faith and I'm the person of doubt. But often it's a mixture of faith and doubt in every human heart. And sometimes in some seasons we're winning the day. In some seasons we're struggling with the things that are happening around us. And yet they coexist. And the great men and women of faith, the people like John the Baptist or King David or the Apostle Peter, who all were great people of faith but also struggled. Like the story of John the Baptist. Jesus comes on the scene, his ministry begins, and John the Baptist is the first to stand out and declare. It says, there is the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world. People are like, What are you saying? This is big news. And he declares it with such faith and courage and strength. Yet near the end of his life, as he sat in a prison, John the Baptist calls his disciples and says, will you go to Jesus and will you ask him if he was the one we were waiting for, or if we should expect another? And Jesus sends them back and says, go tell him what you've seen and heard, the people that are being healed, the lame that are walking, the lives that are being changed. Why? Because John is wrestling with doubt, just like every person who's ever lived and endeavored to live a life of faith. It can be scary to admit our doubts in church or around people of faith. It can be scary to say, you know what, I struggle with that. That's one thing that really makes me wonder, or that thing that happened is a difficult thing. Why? Because we feel like we're the only ones, right? And part of the reason I was so glad that this was chosen as a topic is because I just want to crush the shame that doubt can bring into the human heart. Because in places like this, and maybe not outside the church, maybe in our workplace or other people can feel free to say, you know, I struggle with that. I don't know what to believe about Jesus or about faith. But in our churches, we feel like we can't say anything because we feel a sense of shame, like my faith must be broken. Maybe I don't have any faith at all. Maybe I don't have saving faith. Maybe I don't have a relationship with God because I'm struggling with this doubt or that doubt. But that couldn't be further from the truth, because every great man or woman in the Bible who has enough written about them, enough of their story is told, they all have moments of doubt. Not doubt that causes them to walk away from God, but doubt that makes it difficult to continue on to have the courage that they need to do what God tells them to do. And that is true of me as well. Though I've never been struck by pervasive, long-standing doubt, I've had my moments of doubt. I've had my questions of doubt. I remember one time I was driving from our house when we planted a church in downtown Tulsa. We were driving there, and we were at evening, and I was driving, and I thought, this is just the truth. I was driving, excited about what I was talking about, and the momentary as I'm driving, I was like, do I even believe what I'm going to say tonight? Like, it almost feels impossible to even believe that God could be that good. I was just struck by that, and I looked out my window, and the sun was setting. And I looked out, and I said, God, I don't know about the answer to everything, and I don't even know how to even answer my own questions. But that thing that's happening out my window, I just cannot believe that is a pure accident. So I will cling to that tonight, and I will go into that church, and I will be honest and sincere, and I won't pretend, but I'm going to declare the goodness of God, because what else am I going to hold on to but that? This is what faith is, the courage to believe in the midst of uncertainty. The good news is this: doubt is like let me give this analogy. Doubt is not right or wrong. It's not good or bad. It's like a fork in the road that takes you one direction or the other. Doubt can take you down the road where your faith can be damaged greatly and you can walk away from your faith altogether. Doubt can lead down that way. It is a fork in the road. If you ever lost a loved one through tragedy, you know that that was a fork in the road, wasn't it? And one way could lead you down one path in one direction with your life, and the other path could maybe lead you somewhere else, but you couldn't even see your way down it fully. Doubt is a fork in the road, and what we do with it is what matters most. Not whether we have it or don't have it, but what we do with it is what matters most. And here's the good news. And this is what I believe true from my own story and from the stories of others who have gone before me. Doubt can actually be a catalyst for deeper faith. So we look at doubt and say, this is just a negative. It's only a negative, but that is not true. Doubt can be a catalyst. You know what a catalyst is like? When you introduce one thing into something else, and it can create something totally different than what it was on its own, like a chemical exchange. Doubt can be the catalyst for deeper faith than you had before, and that is true in my story. My faith in God's goodness and God's provision is greater than it was before I ever was diagnosed with a disease, before we ever went through miscarriages, before we ever went through any complications and difficulties in our life, before we ever had our first fight as a married couple, right? My faith is actually greater now. That's the honest truth from my heart. than it was then, because God has been deepening my faith, taking it from shallow, life is easy faith, gonna believe in God because everything is good faith, to a deeper faith, a more robust faith, the kind of faith that's true and can last to the very end. This is what God wants to do in our hearts, not to shame us for doubt, but to draw us out of our doubt when we have that fork in the road and take us down the path that's less traveled, that goes in the direction of more faith rather than less faith. Listen to this quote by author Gary Pranger, who wrote a book called The Gift of Doubt. Highly encourage reading that. He says, if faith never encounters doubt, if truth never struggles with error, if good never battles with evil, then how can faith know its own power? In my own pilgrimage, if I have to choose between a faith that has stared doubt in the eye and made it blink, or a naive faith that has never known the firing line of doubt, I will choose the former every time, and I would too. If I've met someone and I spent time with someone who says they have great faith and are following God and trusting God, and they also tell me they've been through this and that, and I'm shocked that they're sitting here saying that they're a person of faith, then I will trust what they say in a way that I would not trust the others. And I wouldn't trust myself, my older self, like I would my present self in a conversation about who is God and what is his character. In that way, God takes doubt, even the evil of this world, the bad of this world, and he can take it and he can turn it for good. And he can take what springs forward as a negative emotion, a question. You might sit in church one day and say, okay, I'm here, but do I even believe what we're saying? Do I even believe what we're talking about? And God, if you will lean into him, if you will say the simplicity of the prayer the Father said and said, I do believe, but I need you to help my unbelief. God can take that and he can take you down a road of discovery and deepening, even through pain, even through tragedy, and he can bring out of it a faith that you never knew might be possible in your life. That is the gospel. That is who Jesus is. So the question in this room, what I want to spend my remaining moments on, is what do we do if we want to have greater faith, if we want to grow in our faith, if we're hoping that we can go down the one road, the good road that leads to a further road of faith rather than the road of doubt that can lead us shipwrecked on the side of our life. What do we do? Well, I just want to give two thoughts. They're very simple, but they're incredibly important to our next steps together. The first is this: go where faith is. If you want to have more faith, go where faith is. If you want to have more doubt, just struggle and spend time with people who doubt all the time. But if you're going to grow and you're going to develop and you're going to move forward in your faith, then go where faith is. That's why it's so incredibly important for us to be a church. We might think in this day and age, hey, I can stay home. Maybe I own a Bible. Maybe I can listen to somebody preaching from the last week. But when we come together and we encounter things that maybe we don't want to hear about, we don't want to talk about, we didn't expect to talk about even on our own, we're reminded of what we believe and why we believe it. And to just go through the rhythm of being with people of faith who are speaking about faith, it causes us to have a better shot of taking the one road rather than the other. When it comes to doubt, go where people of faith talk about faith, believe with faith. Read the scriptures. That's why it's so important to read the Bible, because then we read the story of a King David who has this great, incredible faith. Remember, what's the greatest moment of David's life? He takes that sling and that stone and he goes out and he does what? He slays that Goliath. And no one believed it was possible, and it seems so uncertain how he could possibly do it, and yet that same David writes the majority of the book of Psalms, and what is the majority of the book of Psalms? Questions and struggle with faith. So I say, God, help me look at the life of David, who had faith yet struggled with faith, and let me see that that might be normal in my life as well, and I can continue to have courage to press against the doubts and the unbeliefs that are around my heart at any given moment. You go where people of faith are: church, reading the Bible, praying together. Why? Because you and I must be continually reminded of what we believe. You know, the truth is, our faith, it leaks, and it leaks because of life, and it leaks because of struggle and disappointment and brokenheartedness. And when it leaks, what are we going to do? God's going to have to come and refill our faith. He's going to have to do it. And how's he going to do it? He's going to bring us back and continually remind us, if we will lean in to those moments, keep going to church even when we're struggling, keep reading the Bible even when we're struggling, keep praying even when we're struggling, and say, God, I want to believe. Will you please help my unbelief? And God then begins to fill us again as we're reminded. You know, coming to Christ is not a one-time decision. I know we talk about it like that, and it is a first time. Our first decision can feel very memorable, but there are many moments where we surrender again to Christ Jesus, and we're reminded of our faith again. That's why I love worshiping with our community here at Anthem, because sometimes we'll sing a song, and I'll just think through my week, or think through what's happening, or think through that I'm about to preach, and sometimes I'll think, God, I don't know if I can even do what you want me to do, but God reminds me, you don't have to do. I have called you. I want to use you in this way, and I walk around. God is true. God is good. This is who God is. I'm reminded of that. So the first is go where faith is. The second is this. When you have struggles, challenges, new questions, new doubts arise on the horizon, then go back to what you do believe. Even when you don't know what to believe about this, go back to what you do know that you believe about something else. Even when this tragedy or this circumstance or this struggle or this question comes up and you say, I don't get this, and this is a real struggle for me, then go back to what you know that you do believe. Like I said, I have a couple things I do whenever I've struggled with a question or struggled with doubt. Once again, I haven't had pervasive, long-standing doubt, but I've had momentary doubts different times in my life and many occasions. I go back to sunsets and sunrises, literally. Number two, I go back to the simplicity of believing that Jesus actually lived. He actually walked on this earth. He actually died and he rose again. And I don't understand that theological question. I don't understand that circumstance issue. I don't understand all the other things, but I'm going to hold fast to what I do believe to be true. And the truth is, for Brad, I just cannot ignore the historical fact that there was a real Jesus. He really did walk and talk among us. He really did die. No one disputes it. No historian disputes it. And I just can't imagine that his disciples would somehow steal his body from a tomb and then go die their own martyrdom deaths because they wouldn't recant their belief in the resurrection. I just cannot believe it. And so when I struggle with faith, what do? That may not be yours. I go back. I believe that Jesus lived, died, and rose again. I don't know the answer to everything else, but I believe that to be true. And then I go back to those handful of moments in my life, 3, 4, 5 moments in my life, that even if you tried to talk me out of them, I just could not be talked out of believing that God had reached out to me in a personal way. So what do? If I want my faith to grow rather than my doubts to grow, if I want to resist unbelief and cling to Jesus, I'm going to go where faith is talked about. And I'm going to do it over and over and over again as a rhythm. And whenever I struggle, I'm going to go back to those things I do believe to be true that feel more solid than the other things. And I'm going to hold on tighter than I ever have before. That's what I'm going to do. And that's what I encourage you to do as you reach out and you walk this journey of faith together. As I close the message today, so much more I'd love to talk about on this issue. But let me end with just very basics of where we've been today, to make sure these stick in our heart. The first is this: being a man or a woman of faith doesn't mean an absence of doubt. Being a man of faith, a woman of faith, doesn't mean you're going to be absent doubt. And you should have no shame about it, no reason to hide it. It's in the hidden places that the worst things happen, not when we bring it to the light. Bring it to the light with people you trust, people you love, people that inspire you, people that have been walking with Christ for some time, and let them process that with you and ask Jesus to help you with your unbelief. And not only that, for others in this room, I want to say, especially if you struggle to believe because questions that are unanswered, believing in Jesus doesn't mean all your questions have to be answered. That's a very high standard, and not a standard that Jesus has ever promised to us. And so sometimes we think, you know what, because I have this doubt, I can't really believe in the gospel. I can't really believe and give my life to Jesus fully. That's not ever going to be true. And if that's your standard, you're going to struggle with every decision in all of your life. Faith is the courage to believe in the midst of uncertainty, unanswered questions, struggles, and it's okay. So I said at the end of the day, God, I'd love for you to answer this, but I'm going to trust you even if you don't. And one day I'll see you and I'll be with you, and my questions will be answered in a way that maybe this life could have never answered at all. Amen? Let's bow our heads. Let's pray this morning.